Hello. So now we'll complete or we'll talk about certain miscellaneous topics which kind of are very important, of course, but haven't necessarily appeared in the context of the flow so far. You will be using some of these one way or the other in real world apps as well as some upcoming applications assignments. Okay. So let's see. First one will be permissions. Handling permissions is an important topic, and then content providers, which is used to transfer data between different components in some way. Okay. As usual, you have links from the guide here. Um, all the examples, codes, and even some codes on the slides are from these links. So in this video, we'll talk about permissions, and later we'll talk about content providers. So permissions, the idea behind permissions is to basically protect the privacy of the user, right? I mean, once again, in the very beginning, we said how Android devices or any mobile devices, all mobile devices are not just a tool that we use, uh, it's in a sense a reflection of our personality, and it's quite true with with the growing intrusion of these technologies in our life, and of course the for at some level for good reasons. Um, with It's not just that I can call someone from my phone anymore. I can message them at any time. I can have information about them on my device. Um, if you have my device, you have my photos with my family. You have information about my special occasions. You have my bank app on it. Um, and you have, as a student, you perhaps have your grades on it, and all sorts of possibly personal information. So it's important that this privacy is respected, and you don't allow a random app to access this sensitive data. So that is very important here. Okay, so that is the key aspect. We also know that apps work in their own sandbox. So how to access data that is outside of the app, there are certain principles which Android started with even from the beginning, and those are the principles that we are following. And accessing data outside of that basically requires permission. So to access any sensitive user data or certain system features like use of internet, um, you require permission. So the app must explicitly ask for the permission, and then the user is in charge of granting or denying the permission. So depending on the feature, depending on the need the user feels about that feature, um, the the app is going to allow or disallow using that. Okay. So the key principle here is, as we know, every Android app runs in its limited access sandbox, and using any resources outside must require permission. No app by default um, can perform any operation that would basically affect the system resources, or um, or affect how the user interacts with it, or how user expects the system to behave. Um, so reading or writing some user's private data should require a permission. And that private data includes the contacts, right? My friend list is private. No other app should be allowed to look at it unless I explicitly grant permissions. So and you have perhaps seen when you install apps like WhatsApp or a new email client, it will ask you whether you allow it to access the contacts. Reading and writing other apps' files, performing network access, using camera, and all such are the examples of, uh, of permissions that an app must ask to use those or access those features. Um, how do you request permissions? We have seen a very brief example like way back when we talked about the manifest file. Basically, you list it in the app's manifest file in XML. And earlier, permissions used to be install time. So when you're installing the app, um, the OS installer goes through the permissions, tells the user that this app is going to use all these, and the user either grants or denies the permission. If the user denied, then the app is just not installed. With Android 6, the change it was changed to runtime permissions, so a user can install the app, and then when you're using a feature, that's when you should access and request permissions, is the new guideline. Um, and you can see the advantage of flexibility there. You would not want users to simply not install and use your apps, because there is some obscure case where um, you're using, maybe you want to send a message, etc. Okay, so that was the idea here. Okay. So with this flexibility now, the guiding principle is ask for the permissions when the user wants to use the feature, and not just at the beginning. If the user denies or revokes a permission, by the way, yes, users can revoke the permissions by going to settings and going to each app and deciding whether this permission should be continued or not. Um, but yes, so if they deny or revoke the permission, gracefully modify the app behavior so the user can still use the app but not really use that feature. And we'll talk a little bit about how to handle denial of permission uh, uh, in a later slide. Um, and yeah, don't assume any specific system behavior. Um, uh, the system is not going to kind of stop using the app or remove it, anything like that. All right, how do you request the permissions in the manifest file? So here is a manifest, and then you have the application tag inside which you have activities and all such. But you have a user's permission tag like this, gives Android name and then Android permission internet. So there are several predefined permissions which you can request here. So it's recommended that you make sure the requested permission offers a clear benefit to the user. We'll talk about that later. And um, the request is done so that it's obvious to them. It's, especially with all the discussion about privacy and all, it's never a good idea to trick anyone into giving you permission, right? Permission has to be very clear. It should be obvious that the users are granting your app a specific permission. Okay. All right. Before moving on, sort of a homework. We'll talk about different permission levels on next few slides. The homework for you is figure out which one this is from those. Is it a normal? Is it a signature permission? Or is it a dangerous permission? Okay, so what is a normal permission? So these are the three permission levels that I just mentioned. What is a normal permission? Normal permission is when um, your app needs to access data or resources outside of the sandbox, but there is very little risk to users' privacy and other operations. An example is setting the time zone. Okay, yes, it is certainly outside of your app, but doing that is not going to affect the user's privacy, or at least not that bad. So these permissions are automatically granted. You won't see a dialog box asking for them. At the same time, you cannot revoke them because, well, the user cannot revoke them because the user didn't explicitly grant them. Um, so for the normal permissions, user is not prompted. They just happen, and the user won't even know. The second type is signature permission. So this is a special category of permissions where they are granted, all of them are granted at install time, but only the app that um, that requested the permission, um, you know, um, is signed with the same certificate, same developer certificate as the one that defined the permission. So, by the way, yes, you can also define your own permissions. In the example here, we saw Android permission internet. You can you can have your own permissions. So, what this signature level creates is a sort of a closed group of permissions that a certain developer decides are important, and then their own group of apps can only access those features using those permissions. The third one is the dangerous permissions. The dangerous permissions are the ones that are likely to affect the user's private information or certain features of the device, which can be dangerous, as the name said. So reading the user's contact is an example here. Okay? And for such permissions, um, the user has to explicitly grant the permission. The user is prompted that now this feature of the app is going to use this particular permission. Uh, do you understand why it's needed, and do you grant the permission? So until the user approves this permission, that the app um, cannot cannot function in that particular aspect. So it cannot provide the functionality that depends on the permission. So if your user does not allow you to access contacts, well, then you cannot send messages to those contacts, uh, or show a list of those contacts in your app, for example. Okay. All right, so request prompts. So here is an example from before Android 6, that is API 22 or below. Android 6 was API 23. And in that, you will see an install level prompt like this. So here the Awesome Notes app, an example from the online guide. It says it needs to access contact, location, and microphone. Contact, why? Because you may want to share the note with with a friend. Location, you may want to add, that something about the note, that this is where it happened, and you may want to dictate your note instead of typing it. So the user looks at it when downloading and installing, decides whether it should do it or not. If if the user says reject, then the app is not installed, and the user cannot basically do anything. He or she does not have any experience with your app. Um, and another feature is, an update of your app. If it adds newer permissions, then the user is prompted to accept those when updating the app. And again, the same thing happens if the user denies the permission, the app is not updated. The user is stuck with the old version of the app. So all that changed in API 23. In API 23, you would see things like this, runtime permissions. So you can see in the background, you're in the app, and now you want to add a friend and share the note with the friend. So you get this dialog box on the left here, where it says, "Do you allow Awesome Notes to access your contacts?" And um, yeah, so this is 23 at runtime, and then the dialog has a deny and an allow button. So that's how it has changed. So um, the okay, and one more thing. So what if the user denies it? So if the user denies it and next time tries to use the same feature, then it shows the same dialog box but with a check button which says never ask again. And if that is clicked, then the permission is never asked and the feature is never executed or never provided to the user. In fact, in API 30, even that has changed. If the user click denies twice, it means the user doesn't want you to ask for the permission again. Okay. Even if the user grants your app the permission, you cannot always rely on having that permission. The user could have gone and changed the permission in the settings for the app. So it is suggested that you always check for and request permission at runtime to guard against any runtime errors. So by the way, if the app does not have the permission and you try to do it, you will get a security exception and the app will crash. So to avoid that, you should always check for the permission at runtime. How do you do that? How do you check for permissions? So there is a call on the context called check self permission. It either returns permission granted or permission denied. If it's granted, well, of course, go ahead and execute the code that required that permission. If it is denied, then call should show request permission rationale. It returns a boolean, either a true or a false. If it returns false, don't show don't show the information about this permission, um, which means the user might have denied it twice in API 30 or similar in the ones before that. Um, but if it returns true, show the user an educational UI which describes why this feature needs a particular permission. For example, camera. The Notes app may require camera, or as we saw, microphone, because you may want to add pictures to the note, or you may want to dictate the note instead of typing it, and then request for the permission. So this is the way to go. So yeah, let's see how you put this in code. Okay. Okay, that pop-up jumped much before it should. No problem. So if context compat dot check self permission, and then it takes the context and a manifest permission requested permission. So this could be the permission that you requested. Um, Change it with that. And if it gives you permission granted, if the call to check self permission returns permission granted, then you basically perform the action, right? Otherwise, um, if the should show permission rationale returns true, then provide this educational UI where you explain to the user why it is required. And in this UI, include a cancel or a no thanks button that allows the user to continue using the app without granting the permission. So don't you should not force your permission on the user in any of these steps. If it did not do that, um, then request permission launcher with the requested permission. If it was denied already, then the OS will handle that part. Okay. Okay. Yes. So you register an activity result callback, which handles this, which gets the result of this request, and then you proceed accordingly. Okay. um, Managing the permission request code, you can either do it manually, but in Android X, they have added a library call. I mean, they have added a library which you should use if you are using Android X. For that, you'll have to add the dependency in Gradle, and then um, use request permission for a single one, or request multiple permissions for multiple permissions at the same time. We'll talk about the system managed permission in the next slides, but you can always look up how to manage it yourself in the online guide. So the system managed permission works like this. This is the um, register for activity result, um, which you give to request permission launcher, and it takes the new request permission, and then is granted. Based on the value of is granted, you either decide whether it's granted, then you continue to the action. Otherwise, you explain to the user why the feature is unavailable, what they are missing, and um, then the user, and basically respect the user's decision. But you can always inform them why they are not able to use the camera or the microphone in the previous example, as we saw. So this is how you can handle permission codes. Now, what happens, or what you should do in case of denial? So now we are kind of going into the best practices area. Okay, so this is what you should be doing, and not be very obnoxious about using your features. Okay. So it says, the guide says, help users to understand the implications of denying the permission. basically make them aware of the features that won't work because of the missing permission. So, guide the user's attention by, you can do any of these 3 points here, guiding the user's attention by highlighting a specific part of the app, where it has now a limited functionality, or, you can do that by either showing a message or displaying a different button that contains, an error code or an error color, something like that. Um, be very specific about it. Don't give a generic message. Tell them exactly why it's not working the way it should. And you could also, by the way, you should not block the user interface. Don't show a full screen warning, but a small dialogue. So the users are not felt intimidated by that. And the key point is to respect the user's decision, even if they deny the permission, right? That's very important. Yeah, finally, permission best practices. Only use the permissions that are necessary for your app. So for example, um, sometimes you may want to consider using intent. So using a camera yourself versus, capturing an image yourself versus using the camera app, firing an intent for that. Of course, there is a trade-off of control. You would have a lot more control if you are capturing the image yourself, but then that is something that you should consider. Um, Second best practice, pay attention to permissions required by the libraries. You may include certain cool libraries, but the libraries require some permissions. And read their documentation, see what permissions they need. If you don't do that, then your app won't function as expected. Third, be transparent. Always be very clear about why you need those permissions and how you are going to use it, and um, let the user decide what they want to do it. So make this information available alongside the permission request, including install, runtime, or any update permission dialogues. And finally, make the system access very explicit. So provide continuous indication when you access sensitive capabilities like camera or microphone, and make it clear to the users that uh, that's make it clear to them when you are using the data, so the users don't perceive that you are stealthily trying to access their data or other sensitive information. Okay, so that's all about permissions. Of course, there is more to it on the user guides, and in real world apps, you'll encounter many of these issues there. Okay, thank you.